So our next theme on emergency response and recovery, we're going to have one plenary speaker and then a panel. And we have with us today Deputy Chief Suzannah Jones from the Texas Department of Emergency Management. And very happy to have you with us today. She's going to talk to us about emergency response and mitigation. And once Deputy Chief Jones has finished her presentation, we'll have some time for Q&A. Once again, you can enter your questions into the Q&A box. So with that, we'll turn it over to you, Deputy Chief Jones. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Terrence. Just to confirm, you can hear me, yes?
Thank you.
All right, great. Well, thank you for inviting us. It's an honor to be here to present at the Natural Hazard Summit and talk to the Academy of Medicine, Engineering, and Science of Texas. You know, y'all are a great resource to a lot of different people, and all the people that are involved in your organization and what you do are a huge part of emergency management in Texas. And that's what I do. So the Texas Division of Emergency Management is a standalone state agency in Texas. That's something new that I'll get to in just a moment. And we are responsible for coordinating the state level response to emergencies and disasters in Texas, everything from natural disasters to man-made disasters. Today, we're going to focus on looking at natural disasters, and I was listening to the great conversation that was going on prior to this session. And there's a lot of things we can talk about in Texas, as you all know. I just told you briefly what TDEM does. Texas Division of Emergency Management, we refer to as TDEM. And like I said, we coordinate the state level response to those events. And Texas is busy, as we all know. My boss likes to say that Texas is #1. And I think as Texans, whether we're from here or not, and ended up here, realize that Texas does everything big. And certainly that applies to disasters, particularly natural disasters as well. And when I say we're #1, it may not be the #1 that we want, but it does hold true, which is one of the reasons we're all here discussing this topic. And that is Texas has more what we term as federally declared disasters than any other state in the US. Right now, I believe we are sitting at 103. And if you can go to the next slide, we can kind of start out there. Actually, if you'll go to the next one. Okay, so FEMA started recording what we refer to as major disasters, which means the disaster has become so big that it outranks any available support at the state, at the local and the state level. And we have asked the federal government to support us, which most people will term as a FEMA disaster. And that means that FEMA is going to step in and provide mostly financial assistance on the recovery and mitigation side, and certainly response assistance. FEMA has been doing that since 1953. And in that time, when I say Texas is #1, I mean that Texas has had more major disaster declarations from the federal government or a FEMA disaster since they started recording this in 1953, which is huge, more than California, more than Florida, more than anywhere else along the Gulf Coast, like Louisiana. They all have a lot, but Texas leads that. So the thing to remember there isn't so much that we have more disasters, federal level disasters, than any other state in the union, but to also understand that those are just federal level disasters. And I won't get into a lot of information about how you get to have a federal disaster. It certainly is worth discussing, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But you have to meet a certain level of costs and disaster in order to qualify. But the important thing is all the disasters we have in Texas that don't qualify for a federal level disaster, which is based on population and some other calculations that the federal government puts down in regulation. So we have a lot of disasters that happen outside of these 102. The other thing to remember is when you average that out, it means we have a federal level disaster about once every 8 months. So when our boss says we're #1 in Texas, we are #1 in disasters in Texas. And it's a fact of life and something that we all come here together to talk about and decide how we respond better, how we mitigate and recover faster and more accurately as well. When they asked us to do this conversation, this presentation, they asked us to talk about all the disasters that had happened in the last couple of decades. And just to throw some more data at you, we've had 34 major disaster declarations in the last 20 years. That is speeding up. I think in the first, from like 2000 to 2010, we had about 13 or 14, and we've had 20 to 21 since then in that second decade, this last 10 years. And so things seem to be speeding up. I'm not on the science side, so I can't effectively say scientifically that, we're getting more disasters. It certainly seems that way to us. We've been extremely busy the last 10 years. Over the last 20, we have several catastrophic level disasters, from Ike to certainly all the disasters we had in the last 10 years, including Harvey, and they just don't stop. Of course, we've had the pandemic, which is something new for us, and also the severe winter weather that we had in February of this year. I think one of the biggest things that I'd like to talk about, if we could go to the next slide, and my team put these together. Actually, let's skip to the next one. And so there's a few slides, and this is a great thing that I want to start off with in this section, and that's talking about every day is recovery day. Not one of the things, but one of the many things we learned really had a huge hit in 2017 with Hurricane Harvey. And I think a lot of people, this group included, did a lot of work during and after that disaster. And there were a lot of changes to emergency management, particularly at the state level at that time. I've been at TDM for the last 10 years. It was certainly the largest disaster we've had since then. One of the greatest things that happened for us was that the governor created the Governor's Commission to Rebuild Texas. And that was about 2 weeks after landfall of Hurricane Harvey in August of 2017. And it really changed the way we do things. During that time, the commission did a lot of hard work on responding, recovering, and mitigating. And there were a lot of changes that came out of that. So later, about a year later, that commission put out a report, presented it to the legislature, that had 44 recommendations on improving emergency management in Texas at all levels. And those 44 recommendations were successfully addressed in the following legislative session in 2019. 43 of the 44 recommendations were met by legislative actions that were taken by the Texas legislature. One of those actions did not require legislative action. And so all 44 recommendations were addressed by the legislature and other agencies in Texas. The greatest thing that came out of there, from my perspective, is the Texas Division of Emergency Management, which used to be a division within the Texas Department of Public Safety, was pulled out from the Texas Department of Public Safety and created as an independent state agency under the umbrella of the Texas A&M University system. And I think this is a great group to talk about what kind of impact that had for emergency management in Texas. The Texas Department of Public Safety, DPS, was fantastic. They are law enforcement focus, and we had a lot of success under that agency. But it was time, because of the catastrophic level of disasters, particularly natural disasters that Texas was facing, to really take a turn and address the things that were lacking, that needed improvement to address the number of disasters were happening, the catastrophic level of disasters that were happening, and to change the way we did things in Texas. And so that move happened. It was a legislative move that removed TDM from DPS and created it as its own independent agency. We've been that way since September 1 of 2019. One of the best things that I think will resonate with this audience is that we increase the number of people on what we call the Texas Emergency Management Council. And the Texas Emergency Management Council is a group of 35 plus state agencies and other organizations that come together and help that coordinate that response to disasters across the state. And one thing that really happened that was one of the greatest improvements we've had is adding all the public university systems in Texas. So Texas A&M University system, the UT system, Texas Tech system, the U of H, University of Houston system, Texas State University, I'm probably going to miss one, but all the public university systems in Texas became members of the Texas Emergency Management Council. The greatest thing about that is all of a sudden we had all of these resources available at our fingertips that enabled us to make better data-driven decisions about being able to respond better, recover from disasters more quickly, and mitigate and maximize the funding that we had to do that. So that was one of the biggest lessons that we learned in Harvey, and a great success of Texas, the legislature, and all the people involved with that, to create a system which allowed us to use scientific data to make decisions about how we improve things. And we've been working on that for the last 3 years. There are several organizations that have been created, committees to bring together and allow us to increase the way we, or better the way we mitigate, recover, and respond. And inviting those university systems into the Emergency Management Council has given us a wealth of resources to do that. So that's one of the biggest things that happened in emergency management in Texas that have allowed us to open up, really open our eyes to improving the way we do things. So we spend, I think the first week of November, we have a research summit. It's in College Station. There are a lot of other people involved that we talk about responding, recovery, and mitigation. Which moves me to this slide, which we talk about every day is Recovery Day. When we, in 2019, when we became our own agency, Chief Kidd had a conversation with senior leadership and said, you know what, every day is Recovery Day. And really, the response side of things are extremely important. I'm a recovery and mitigation person, but I've been on both sides of the ship, so to speak. And one thing we know is that Texans respond very, very well. Not that they don't need help, but we've got that down. It's acute. It's something, I won't say it's more important or less important than recovery or mitigation, but getting out there and saving lives and rescuing people when they're stranded on their roofs during a flood or a hurricane is a very important thing to do. The thing is that lasts a week, several days, a week, 2 weeks. Recovery goes on for a lot longer, years. We still have our oldest open disasters are Hurricane Dolly and Hurricane Ike for 2008. So from a recovery perspective, we are still working disasters that are, over a decade old. So recovering takes time, not just the financial management part of those grants, but certainly, as we all know, dealing with having to live with a disaster or facing disaster after disaster after disaster, as many communities across particularly coastal Texas understand. And so, when we talk about every day as Recovery Day, the way we really change things after Harvey is that when an event happens, in a hurricane, for example, when we know a hurricane is bearing down on the Texas coast, we would immediately activate the State Operations Center and bring all those, the first responders out in the field, get everybody hyped up in the SOC, ready to face whatever natural disaster was coming. And what we learned is that at that exact same time, we effectively activate our recovery and mitigation staff as well. So from the minute we know a hurricane is bearing down, or for the minute we know that flooding is happening and people need help out in Houston or Jefferson County or Nueces County or Cameron County, wherever that might be across Texas, recovery and mitigation activates at the same time. And we have so much going on that effectively, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about the emergency management cycle. Texas honestly is in that cycle constantly. Right now, with what's happened in the last couple of years, we are constantly responding, recovering, mitigating, and preparing all at the same time. So it became very important to recognize that every day is Recovery Day, and we need to start out from the beginning when we respond, thinking about recovery and mitigation as well. Next slide, please. This is just, I won't read through this. This is just some things that we've talked about with every day is Recovery Day. We have a lot of different tools that we've come up with since Hurricane Harvey hit, and in the advent of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and that started last year, and also the severe winter weather. A lot of that is looking at how do we bring in other agencies, non-traditional emergency management agencies to help us, like Texas A&M AgriLife, which has been a fantastic partner of ours. Also during the pandemic, we've worked a lot with the UT system and different parts of the A&M system, and I believe Texas Tech, to work on different programs that have helped, like looking quality control for PPE and different vaccination programs. And when we were trying to buy PPE, even developing PPE with 3D printers and all kinds of really interesting things that helped us move forward in the early days of COVID when we had so much going on. Next slide, please. I'll get to the pandemic in just a second. I know we're getting close on time, and I definitely want to leave some time for Q&A. So we've spent a lot of time talking about how many disasters in Texas, and the really big turning point for a lot of impactful things that happened with Hurricane Harvey, the Governor's Commission to Rebuild Texas, bringing on all those public university systems that allowed us to have a wealth of resources and information in order to better make decisions about emergency management, responding, recovering, and mitigating. And I want to take note and say COVID has really, blown everything out of the water from a responding perspective, also to recovery and mitigation, which also for COVID is all happening at the same time. And I want to say that every disaster we face has something we've never faced before, even if it's one hurricane after another. There is always something that pops up that makes it different. Certainly when the pandemic broke out when it started last February, and there was a mad rush to buy PPE, all of a sudden we had to become experts in 100 different things that we had never thought about before. Buying PPE, doing quality assurance of PPE, trying to figure out how to do testing when there was no test around. And then TDM had all kinds of involvement in trying to get test tubes and nose swabs and moving all of that equipment around with the supply chain shortages and transportation issues and everything being shut down. So the pandemic itself has created, as we go, a really huge learning experience for us. But I still think it goes back to great coordination, because all of a sudden what happened, we had a good relationship with public health in Texas, particularly at the state level, the State Department of State Health Services, which handles the public health and medical piece of disasters, and having to work really tightly with them on things that were really not our area of expertise. As emergency managers, we believe in an all hazards response, which means we plan, we prepare, we respond, we recover and mitigate to all types of disasters, whether they're natural or man-made, in basically the same way. I will say from experience, that's important and we need to do that. But certainly the pandemic threw a wrench in some of that. And so all of us have had to learn different areas or get up to speed on areas of public health and medical. And I think the COVID experience has shown us there are a lot of different non-traditional emergency management partners that we need to work more carefully with. Those public university systems play a huge part in that because of their relationship with the medical communities, their own medical schools, that have really played a big part in COVID. So I think my theme through this whole discussion is talking about how important it is to really partner with the right people, both at the state and the local level. The changes that have happened since Harvey that have allowed us to have better interaction and just knowledge about the resources that are available on the research and academic side that have improved the way we manage disasters. And really, I think finally, what I want to touch on basically is the 2021 winter weather that happened in February, another event that was quite new to Texas. Certainly, I'm a native Texan and I've lived in colder places before. And literally, I thought in February that I was living in the middle of Minnesota because I was not used to the cold and losing power and losing water and all of that. I mean, really on a big level, that was a huge eye opener from a state perspective and public utilities and ERCOT and the Public Utilities Commission. And again, ensuring that with that coordination pieces in part, seriously looking at things like generators and what do we mitigate now and how do we best focus on mitigation, which honestly, I can make an argument that mitigation is really what emergency management is about in total. And that's trying to either keep disasters from happening, which we know is not going to happen, or to minimize or eliminate the impacts of disasters. Texas receives a lot of money from the federal government to put things back in place after damages have happened from a disaster. And they also spend a lot of money in Texas for mitigation, which is extremely important. And really, really important for that part is using our academic partners and our research partners to provide the data-driven decisions that we need to make on how we best use mitigation funds. During Harvey, just for example, we received just under about I want to say it was just over $1 billion in mitigation funding, which we are still working through with a lot of jurisdictions. We know for COVID that we've received about $550 million in mitigation funds. And we're really using our partnerships to make determinations on the best way to use those mitigation funds. So I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you. I'll stop there because I'd love to have time for Q&A. But we appreciate the relationships we have. And really that's what I think is important to get across in this conversation, is making sure you have those relationships and that you're using the data and the research and the academic resources you have to create better recovery or response recovery and mitigation in Texas.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Jones. Great presentation, and really glad that you could be with us today. So we do have some time for questions now, and I know there'll be a lot of interest in hearing some more from you. So out there in the audience, if you have additional questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A box. Deputy Chief Jones, you talked about at the top of your presentation how Texas is tied for first place for natural disasters, and we're basically averaging about one every 8 months. Is there anything strategically, and this question comes from Kishore Mehta of Texas Tech, our co-chair of the planning committee for this summit, is there anything strategically that the Texas Division of Emergency Management can do on the mitigation side to help us maybe go lower down that ranking from our tied for first place for natural disasters?
Yes, there is. And there's a couple of things that I'll mention. I could go wax poetic on this topic for a very long time. But one thing we do have, which you're probably aware of, is a state hazard mitigation plan that FEMA requires in order for us to get mitigation funding. It's a huge document. It's probably 300 pages. It is posted on the TDM website. We renew or update that plan once every 5 years. And I think we're coming up next year to really start hard on a plan that's due 2023. And what this lays out, and it's just a very short description, is it's a threat analysis about what the threats are in Texas. We have some organizations we work with to do that threat analysis, and then a list of possible or probable projects in Texas. Now, the state level plan really should have huge, like watershed level type mitigation projects. I think, I'm not saying the plan hasn't been taken seriously, because it is, but I think that's an area where we can really improve. And I think when I talk about those relationships with academic and research in the universities, that's an area where we really need to get together and work with everyone to see how do we best spend those mitigation funds that come in, because that plan informs where we spend those funds. The second part is local jurisdictions who want to use those federal mitigation funds. And I keep harping on federal mitigation funds because there's a lot of them, but these plans can also be used for other type of funding. Is that local plans, sometimes by county level, mostly by county level, sometimes counties together create their own local mitigation plans. All the information about what jurisdictions have plans is available on our website as well. But I think that's key as well, not just the state level plan, but to work at the jurisdiction level and see what are really viable mitigation projects. So when we do have a disaster that comes in and we get mitigation funds, that we effectively, I won't say have canned projects ready to go, but that's key, because frankly, after Harvey, trying to deal with all that recovery and then say, hey, pull out your great mitigation plans, people weren't really focused on that. So I think if we have blue skies in Texas, which don't happen a whole lot, we should really be focusing on helping local jurisdictions have good quality plans together, and at the state level as well. So I think that's one of the ways we get away from, again, we're not going to get away from hurricanes or floods happening in Texas, but how we better protect our infrastructure and our people. I think that's really key. And I see real quick, the database on major disasters, if you will Google FEMA disasters on your computer, it pulls up the FEMA database on all the disasters. You can filter by state and type of disaster and things like that. It's a very good database.
Great. Well, I think what you were just talking about with local jurisdictions kind of transitions well to the next question from Lisa Craig. So for non-emergency local or state agencies that want to get in touch with TDM and coordinate on engagement and mitigation, what do you recommend as the first step?
So I think the first step would be, and we can certainly, y'all have my contact information, but share our contact information. And I'll send some contacts on the mitigation side, but just reach out to TDM basically and let us know you're interested. We try, and every year before hurricane season, so in May, send out notifications to all state agencies. Sometimes that's a hard thing because the notifications aren't going to the right people, but absolutely right. Reach out to TDM. We'll provide the correct contact information. We think that's crucial. Like I said, there are 30+ agencies that are sit on the Emergency Management Council, but what a lot of state agencies don't know is that they're all eligible for FEMA funding. So when you have a disaster, they are all eligible applicants. And so I think there's a lot of money that goes, I won't say wasted, but goes unused that certainly state agencies are eligible for. So please reach out.
Great. We have a question from Hanadi Rafai from University of Houston, another co-chair of the planning committee. You mentioned a November research conference or summit at Texas A&M University. Is that open to the research community?
I think it's a closed meeting, and I don't mean that in private, but I just think limited by time. But there are more coming up, and I will provide some information to you, Terrence, and your team that you can share. Certainly, they're not meant to be closed to anyone, and we want more people to be involved. So I will make sure that we have information. They should be reaching out to all the universities, but like I said before, we have that problem where it's not necessarily going to the wrong people, but not necessarily going to all the right people. So we'll provide some information on how to contact if you're interested from a research perspective.
Thank you. Another question here from Christine Economides, one of our TAMEST members at the University of Houston, says that recent headlines related to minority populations that have not received enough funding to rebuild after Harvey. Can you comment on the social justice implications of disaster recovery? We actually have a whole panel dedicated to this topic coming up next, but from the Division of Emergency Management's perspective, how do you incorporate equity and making sure that all communities are helped really with your programs?
Right. And this is it's a really important question. It's certainly come up. You're talking about Harvey. It's certainly come up with COVID. From the federal side, on the COVID side, they've spent a lot of time requiring data and demographic information to ensure we're reaching those communities. But really, to get away from COVID and talk about Harvey, it is a really difficult thing, because what I want to say is, we don't make differentiations based on, minority populations. We just go out there and help people. The problem is, I think, is that not that anybody has any intent of not helping everybody, because I think that's everybody's intent. But sometimes in the middle of these things, you don't realize that you're not doing enough to reach the right communities. And so our role in the state is to provide support to local jurisdictions to ensure that they have what they need to reach those communities. And honestly, I think that's something that we've been building on at the state level, is creating a better platform or foundation to help jurisdictions do that through, whether that's, I want to say things like, social media and things like that, but we all know those kinds of elements don't always reach the communities we need them to reach. And so a lot of that has been trying to drive a new grassroots foundational campaign and provide support to jurisdictions to figure out how we target those underserved communities. Like I said, we've been doing a lot of work in COVID, and a lot of that came from work from Harvey and learning with those jurisdictions. But just to kind of give you an example, we're still working really hard on that. FEMA has not completed writing projects for Harvey. 4 years in, we're still in the midst of that. So we have spent a lot of time working with FEMA to try and outreach to those communities. But I also will say that this is a great opportunity for our, specifically our local partners and other academic partners to help us improve upon that too. Because like I said, we get in that mode where we're like, okay, we're doing everything we can. We just know now that everything we can, even with the best of intent, doesn't necessarily reach those communities, those underserved communities. So it's constantly, it's something that's probably brought up every day. And we're constantly looking at ways to support our local jurisdictions in doing that, and also explain the complexities that is FEMA funding. We know it's not brain surgery, but it's extremely complex. And so we're working on it every day, but we're also open arms to help with suggestions on how to make that better as well.
Well, thank you. That does it for all the time that we have for questions, and want to thank you again for taking the time to meet with us today and present some of what the Division of Emergency Management is doing. Hope that we can call on you again and keep the connection going so that we can have more communication between the research community and the emergency response policymaking side.